and we have to really escalate the noise we make so that we'll be heard.
Welcome to Gay USA. I'm Andy Hum.
I am Ann Northrup.
Big news this week. The United States Supreme Court agreed to take 3 cases that will determine whether discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity is prohibited under federal law that prohibits sex discrimination. And our guest is Professor Arthur Leonard of New York Law School, who has been tracking the progress of this legal principle for decades.
Now, I don't want them to think all hope is lost. There are ways to come back from this if we lose, but we'll discuss all that. In better news, Tampa, Florida has elected the first out LGBT mayor of a major Florida city.
Dr. Richard Green, a pioneer in the normalization of homosexuality and a big advocate for transgender people, has died at 82.
And a terrible story, a bullied gay teen has taken his own life in Alabama, and a local sheriff who mocked him was suspended.
Lyra McKee, the young journalist who was killed by the dissident IRA in Northern Ireland, took on neglected stories, including the plight of young lesbians such as herself.
And Andy will have some theater reviews: Beetlejuice, Burn This, Gary with Nathan Lane, and Hadestown with Andre DeShields.
But our guest is Arthur Leonard, who is the Robert F. Wagner Professor of Labor and Employment Law at New York Law School, editor of LGBT Law Notes online, you can read those, and a legal writer for the Gay City News. You've been at New York Law School since 1982. You've been tracking these cases for decades. Where do we stand?
Where do we stand? We're finally in the Supreme Court, which is not where we necessarily wanted to wind up at this point in time.
Yeah, not with these justices.
Although we had to admit that eventually this issue was going to be decided by the Supreme Court. It was just a question of when, what cases would be the vehicle. We were not, when I say we, I say the LGBT legal movement was not pushing for this to go to the Supreme Court. The 2 cases were appealed by the employers who lost in the courts of appeals, and one by a local attorney down in Georgia representing a gay man whose case was thrown out by the trial judge.
So they're all different cases. 2 of them deal with sexual orientation. We'll talk about them. And one of them deals with gender identity. So, and these will be heard separate, those 2 and
the sexual orientation cases will be consolidated for 1 hour of argument. So the attorneys for those 2 cases are going to have to battle out who's going to argue. And the gender identity case will be heard separately, because the Title VII sexual orientation cases are what you call private cases. They're between individuals and companies. The gender identity case was brought by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, a government agency, back in the days of the Obama administration. That's how long it takes cases to get to the Supreme Court. So this is a case from years ago. The EEOC is the agency that interprets and enforces Title VII. And they decided there was merit to this case. It involved a funeral director who told her boss that when she came back from vacation, she'd be coming back as a woman. She was hired as a man. And that she would comply with the dress code that the funeral home had for its female employees. And after thinking it over for a few days, the owner of the funeral home said, no, not on my watch. I'm not going to have a man wearing a woman's outfit in my funeral home.
Did the funeral director raise religious objections?
Yeah, he said that actually running a funeral home was his religious calling in life, that he felt, comforting the mourners and everything was a religious obligation. And he ran his funeral home on religious principles. He had religious tracts available for people. But it is, of course, a business. It's not a church. But he tried to raise the Religious Freedom Restoration Act as a defense in his case.
And this woman is Amy Stevens. I don't know if we can pull her picture up out of our list there, but...
So she won her case in the lower court. The employment case...
She won in part and lost in part. This is complicated. What happened is when she filed her claim with the EEOC, and they had just recently decided that gender identity cases can be brought under Title VII, and that they would make this one of their leading test cases. So they filed on her behalf in federal district court, and the funeral home moved to dismiss the case on the grounds that Title VII doesn't cover gender identity claims.
Right.
The district judge said under Sixth Circuit precedent, at that time, it does, but only under the sex stereotyping theory, because there have been cases in the Sixth Circuit more than 10 years before involving a fireman who was transitioning and a police officer who was transitioning. And in both cases, the Sixth Circuit said that discrimination against a transgender person is discrimination based on failure to conform to gender stereotypes. And so it could be brought under Title VII. So the judge said, yes, this case can go forward on that theory. Then they go forward, they have discovery, they have motions for summary judgment, and the judge at that point has to deal with the defenses that the funeral home will raise. And they raise the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which is a federal statute that says the federal government cannot put a substantial burden on someone's free exercise of religion unless they have a compelling justification, and they're using the least restrictive alternative to reach that justification. And the trial judge said that the funeral home wins on the Religious Freedom Restoration Act.
Where does it say in the Bible that you can't treat people who are transgender decently?
Well, it does in the Bible say that it's a sin to cross-dress. It does.
Well,
in the Old
it
Testament.
also
And the New
promotes
Testament allows it, as
slavery
you
and
see
a
from
lot
the
of other
Pope.
And
things.
to eat pork and lobster and
mix
But you know,
fabrics.
whenever it comes to homosexuality or transgender people always fade back to the Old Testament and revive those Old
Yes.
Testament things that Christians are supposed to not pay a lot of attention to, I suppose.
Uh,
But so this case went up to the Sixth Circuit,
Yeah.
and the EEOC appealed it to the Sixth Circuit because they felt that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act shouldn't bar this claim, and the Sixth Circuit agreed with them. And in the course of that decision, they also affirmed the trial judge's finding that there was a violation of Title VII. So now it's the funeral home that appealed to the Supreme Court.
All right. So, and on
Little
the
complicated.
employment cases, we have differing opinions. One
Right, the
in
sexual orientation,
Yeah,
yeah.
the New York case was one on the grounds that there was an inappropriate firing for sexual orientation.
Well,
the Georgia court
that
case.
hasn't been decided yet.
Oh.
You know,
Right.
that,
The New
that's
York
thing.
case is about a skydiver,
Right.
Daniel Zarda. We should give
Donald Zarda.
Donald Zarda. Sorry.
Zarda.
Donald Zarda was a skydiving sort of instructor.
Instructor.
He was going to do a tandem jump. I've done one. And you're tethered to this person. And the woman was nervous about having this guy tethered to him. So he said, don't worry, I'm 100% gay. At which point the employer says, out.
I don't want you coming out to your customers while you're, tied to them.
Heaven forbid.
Yeah.
So now, not to make it too
Evidently, her boyfriend objected.
Yeah, she told her boyfriend, and her boyfriend objected to
and
it.
not to make it too complicated, but he died in 2014 in a skydiving accident.
Right.
But his estate has pursued this
Right.
case.
So what happened in that case? This was filed in federal district court out on Long Island, and the skydiving company Altitude Express filed a motion to dismiss the claim because they said Title VII doesn't cover it. And this is in federal district court. But they had also filed a claim in the federal district court case under the New York human rights law. So the judge agreed that Title VII doesn't cover it because Second Circuit precedent at the time would say it didn't cover it. But I'm going to let it go to trial under the New York human rights law. And a jury ruled against Zarda. But he decided to appeal not on the jury verdict on the New York state claim, but on the judge's refusal to hear the federal claim. And so that went up to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and a 3-judge panel, which is the normal size for a direct review, said Second Circuit precedent bars this claim, but they filed a petition for reconsideration by the entire circuit. That's called en banc. And the entire circuit heard it and reversed their precedents and agreed with the position that the EEOC has taken in other cases, that sex within Title VII includes sexual orientation.
I'm getting a headache.
Yeah, it's complicated.
We should also bring in the Georgia case as well.
Yes.
The Georgia case, Mr. Bostic, who was working
Gerald
for
Bostic.
Gerald Bostic was working for a local agency, county agency, and when they found out he was gay, they fired him. He claims, and he filed a lawsuit. The federal judge threw it out. Said within the 11th Circuit, we don't entertain these sexual orientation claims under
The
Title VII.
precedent is not
Right.
to
The precedent's the
read
other
it
way.
that way.
1979.
A 1979
precedent.
case.
Yeah.
And the 11th Circuit has stayed with that precedent. They upheld the dismissal in this case, and the local attorney representing Mr. Bostic filed a petition with
All
the
right.
Supreme Court.
So-
So these all arrived at the Supreme
what I
Court
want to
around the
get to,
same
though,
time.
is that this is not a novel concept. Trying to say sexual orientation, and especially transgender, is covered under sex discrimination. How far back do these cases go where this has been so ruled?
Well, the gender identity cases were going back to the beginning of this century. We're going back 10 to 15 years when courts started to accept the argument that discrimination on the basis of gender identity is a form of sex discrimination. We have cases under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, we have cases under the Fair Housing Act, we have cases under the Violence Against Women Act, and finally, in around 2004, we had the Sixth Circuit in a gender identity case involving a firefighter who was transitioning. As far as sexual orientation goes, that's a more recent development. We didn't start to get those until just a few years ago.
So Masha Gessen, writing about this new development in the New Yorker, said it was like watching a vase fall off a fireplace mantle when you couldn't get to it in time, and it was an interminable path to catastrophe. Is this something
I think that's overstating it in the sense that we have protections against discrimination in about 20 states at this point under state law.
More than 50% of the population of the United States.
And then you add in all the cities in other states.
Right.
For example, we don't have Pennsylvania at the state level, but every major city in Pennsylvania bans sexual orientation discrimination, an issue we'll be getting back to if we have time later in the segment. So a substantial portion of the population is protected. Where are people not protected? In the Southeast and in the mountain states in particular.
But there has been talk that if we lose these cases, and I would say, we're at best 50-50 on this at the moment?
It's hard to say.
It could open the door for a lot of challenges to those laws.
No, because this isn't a constitutional case. This is a case of interpreting a statute that was passed in 1964 that was proposed in the House of Representatives without even listing sex as a prohibited ground of discrimination. At the last minute, a Southern congressman proposed an amendment on the floor of the House to add sex.
As a joke.
Not as a joke.
A way to kill the Civil Rights Act.
As a way to try to make the total act unpassable.
Yes.
But the amendment passed. The House the next day voted in favor of the act. It went to the Senate. It didn't go to committee in the Senate. There was a special deal struck to send it directly to the floor because they were afraid all these Southern Democratic committee chairs would bottle it up in committee and it would never get to the floor. It got to the floor. It had the longest filibuster in American history up to that time, and it finally passed. And then Title VII, which had been amended to add sex, went into effect in July of '65, and right away, the EEOC started to get complaints of sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination, and they said, we have no jurisdiction. Sex does not mean that. And that was their solid position until relatively recently. It was during the Obama administration that the EEOC changed its position. In 2012,
it was shocking.
It was Kai
wonderful.
Feldblum, who Obama appointed, and she worked on the commissioners.
But on a common sense level, it's sort of easy for a lot of people to understand how when you are discriminated against because you're gay or transgender, that it's because you're not fulfilling a gender role or a sex role.
Or if you reduce it right down to its heart, discrimination against people because of their sexual orientation or their gender identity is all about sex.
But it's not about the sexual act. It's about
their
gender
sex.
roles.
It's about identity.
Their identity, their gender, how they live their lives in accord with their gender.
And it makes no sense to us, and we think it should be outlawed. But the fact is that the right wing does not agree with that and wants the freedom to discriminate on that basis.
Well, and we also have to consider there are some people who take the position they would love it if Congress would pass the Equality Act and outlaw this form of discrimination and put this outside of the courts deciding whether it's covered or not. But they said they would say that there's a separation of powers in this country, and it's Congress that makes the policy, and it's the executive branch that enforces the law. And that for the EEOC to adopt this interpretation and for the federal courts to adopt this interpretation is to legislate. to take something Congress adopted in 1964 and to give it meanings that Congress never intended back then. So part of the argument, and I think, when people look at what the Supreme Court does with this case, there's a great temptation to treat this as totally political as to how this case is going to be decided. I think the New York Times editorial the other day on this case, it was written from an entirely political perspective. It didn't pay any attention to the question of theories of statutory interpretation. How do you interpret a 50-plus-year-old statute today in the light of our modern life?
Plus which,
one school of thought, dynamic statutory interpretation, says you develop statutory language and you adapt it to the times and you keep it up to date, or else Congress would have to be busy amending statutes all the time.
Right.
So let the courts do that. Let the administrative agencies like the EEOC do that. Other people say, no, it's up to Congress. If Congress doesn't want to change it, it has to remain what it meant in 1964.
And even if we win these cases, and even if the Congress writes an Equality Act and passes it, not immediately with
it's been
Trump.
Introduced again.
The House will do that.
Yeah,
but
the House will probably.
Will not the right wing remain relentless in continuing to go to court to try to get even a congressional law declared unconstitutional on the grounds that it violates the religious liberty of the First Amendment?
What they would be looking for is an exemption from compliance if there are religious grounds. And the courts have entertained requests for religious exemptions, but they've treated them rather narrowly. I mean, the employers that have the strongest claim for religious exemptions are not-for-profit religious organizations. Churches, social service agencies affiliated with churches, things of that sort, have the strongest constitutional claims. But even as to that, the Supreme Court has narrowed those exceptions, and they've said as a matter of federal constitutional law, individuals and businesses do not have a general right based on religious beliefs not to comply with the anti-discrimination
But we're talking
laws.
about now the current court as constructed by Trump, which may get worse.
That's true.
And we certainly have the Hobby Lobby case, which expanded these
The
religious
Hobby Lobby
rights.
case was not a constitutional case. It was
But
an
it's a-
interpretation of the Federal Religious Freedom Restoration
Yes,
Act.
and my point being that the right wing is now in power in a way, and in the court potentially, that all these past values may disappear.
Which is why I have said that the Judiciary Act, and other people are talking about this, including Pete Buttigieg, needs to be amended to expand the court and the federal courts to balance it again. That's for a political case. But we can give people some good news in Philadelphia, where a religious agency in Philadelphia, Catholic Social Services, wants to discriminate against not just LGBT, but non-Catholics. And the city of Philadelphia says, we've got a non-discrimination law. If you're going to get our money, you can't do it. So we won that.
Adoption and
Well,
foster
this
care.
case shows the importance of investigative journalism, because what happened was a reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer decided it as a project to see whether religious social service agencies in Philadelphia were complying with the city's human rights ordinance, which prohibits sexual orientation discrimination. So they went around and they asked them, do you allow married same-sex couples to adopt or be foster parents? Do you approve them for that? And 2 agencies out of, I think, 30, there were religious agencies. It's amazing how many agencies the city subcontracts its duties to. And so 2 of them,
in all areas.
2 of them, Catholic Social Services and Bethany, said, no, we don't deal with same-sex couples. And so they ran an article in the Philadelphia Inquirer, and they were reading that in City Hall, and the City Human Rights Commission said, hey, we better get in touch with these people, because their contract with the city is to provide secular, not religious services, and to provide them consistent with our anti-discrimination policy. So they get in touch. Bethany backed down and said, we will deal with same-sex couples.
They're backing down in Michigan,
They're backing
too.
down. But, well, that's because the new lesbian attorney general said they would. But, we're doing good on the electoral front.
Yes.
But Catholic Social Services hung tough. They said, we have a First Amendment right, to take our religious beliefs into account. And the Human Rights Commission said, well, not under a contract with the city where taxpayer money is coming into you. And they have year-to-year contracts, and they said, we're inclined to let this expire and not renew it. And in the meantime, we're not going to refer any more kids to you for adoption or foster placement. And so the Catholic Services went to court, and they sought an injunction against the city. And the trial judge turned them down. And this Monday, The Third Circuit Court of Appeals turned them down unanimously.
So that's a win. We should put all
That's a
this
win.
in perspective for our viewers. The Supreme Court's not going to even hear the big three cases that we talked about at the beginning of this until the next term, which starts on the first Monday of October. So, and the decision might not come out until June of 2020.
It may take that long, but there were only 9 petitions that were granted by the court for next term before Monday.
So far.
And so then they added these 3, and there were 2 other cases added. But if you look at the number of argument days, starting at the beginning of October, and they usually do 2 or 3 cases a day, and you start counting, this could be argued as early as sometime late October, early
Yes,
November.
but they like to hold bombshells till June.
And they
Well,
could take a
it
lot more
depends.
cases between now and then.
Yeah, and they schedule cases for hearing once all the briefing is done. And the Solicitor General, especially this Solicitor General, is notorious for requesting extensions of time to file his
Right.
briefs.
Well,
So
and finally,
it could stretch out a
the
little.
court took its time deciding to take this case. They delayed that. So who do you think is responsible for deciding to take these cases?
I think this could be a unanimous decision by the court to take these cases. The reason being that one of the primary reasons to take a petition is when there is a split of authority among the lower
Yes.
federal courts about what a federal statute means.
Yes.
Because federal statutes mean the same thing everywhere in the country, right? It's federal law. It shouldn't mean one thing in New York and another thing in
Well,
Georgia.
that is why the court takes it.
So that's why. So this was an obvious one. It was just a question of timing. When
And
would
very,
they take it?
very briefly, there are 2 other cases they might take. One is
Right.
about cake and a wedding, and the other is about transgender students, where anti-transgender parents are suing a school in
Right.
Boyerstown.
Well, thank you, Art, for wading us through this complicated stuff. And we will stay in touch with you to stay in touch with these cases and see what's going on.
Follow Art on Facebook and read his LGBT law notes at New York Law School. And that's a good way to keep up day to day.
Yeah. Thank you for coming in, Art.
Thank you.
Okay. See you soon. So we did win this case in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia about Catholic social services. And the great thing is that the judge in the case said the reason that the city prevailed with its non-discrimination law over the Catholic services religious claim is that the city clearly bore no ill will to the religion, was not punishing the religion, criticizing the religion, was simply applying the law neutrally over for everybody in its awarding of government funds. And we've been following in Michigan similar cases about religious agencies and adoption foster services. And there, too, the Catholic agency is resisting. But as in Philadelphia, according to Art, Bethany Services has backed down and will work with same-sex couples. So that's good news.
And, you know, since we last met, the redacted Mueller report came out. And, you know, I love what Elizabeth Warren said about this on CNN. I'm not supporting any particular candidate, but she said anybody else who did this would be arrested and in jail. Any other human being.
I liked her description of reading it. She said she was on a plane and had the report, and she just sat there and read the whole thing. And by the time she got to the end of it, she said, he's got to be impeached.
Right.
And I thought that was a meaningful analysis.
And, you know, I don't know, you know, Eugene Robinson at the Washington Post said, you know, you can't appease this guy no matter what you do, whether you do impeachment or you don't do impeachment. He's now going to run roughshod over the law continually.
And he's a bully, and he has to be stopped as a bully. He has to be stood up to, whether you can have an effect on him or not. You cannot cave into a bully.
Well, the Justice Department is, and so we don't even have that anymore.
Well, they're not caving into a bully. They're collaborating
And
with him
it
as
looks
his
like
partner.
collusion. And it looks like they're going to prevail, the Trump administration, about adding a citizenship question to the census, which will boost, again, the power of the red states.
Let's get to some of this stuff with the Democratic candidates this week. I was very disappointed to see that Mayor Pete was not willing to stand up for voting rights for people in jail and prison.
But the only place they do that is Vermont, but of course everybody
and
should be able to vote.
Massachusetts, I think, too, yeah. And, of course, Meghan McCain's head blew off at the idea of allowing prisoners to vote because that means terrorists could vote. But, you know, do we have a country? Do we have a constitution?
Right.
Do we value all our citizens?
Right.
You take away people's freedom, you punish them for acts like that. but every citizen should have the right to vote no matter where they are.
Yeah.
And I think Mayor Pete is, again, a little blind to the issues of racism in this, because putting mass incarceration of people of color is another way to do voter suppression. And of course, until recently, they wouldn't let them vote when they got out.
And many of the Democrats don't even seem to want to address prosecuting Trump after he leaves the White House. Oh, they get all like,
Well, it's a little premature. Let's
Premature?
get him out first. Meanwhile, I did think Pete had a good answer when Rick Grenell, the gay German ambassador to Germany, was cited as standing up for his great friend Mike Pence. And Pete said, well, I may not be a master fisherman, but I recognize bait when I see it, and I'm not taking it.
Buttigieg also did an advocate interview, mostly about gay stuff, and he now says he came out to himself when he was in his 20s and did tell a good friend. He met Chasten on something called Hinge, which I don't know about.
Maybe you should.
He refers to himself as the first out queer person to get this far in the process.
Yeah, queer.
And he's moving up in the polls. He is the hot item.
Yes,
I mean,
yes. We'll see how
Biden, Sanders is still in first. Biden.
It's a long horse race to run.
Long horse race.
And meanwhile, Randall Terry is showing up at his rallies dressed as Satan.
Oh, I love it. He should pay them if they don't. And Mike Gravella's running again. We had him on this show.
He'll come back here. Barney Frank says that Pete being out gay is an asset to him, and I couldn't agree more about that.
So Kirsten Gillibrand sees all this gay stuff, and she has to get involved. So when she was out in Iowa, she partied with drag queens at a Des Moines gay bar last week, blazing saddles, and said she felt underdressed, so she bought a dress, but that it fit this drag queen Vanna Vanna better than her.
Yes, and we've seen the pictures, and it did. So she had to turn the dress over to her. Now, what do we think about Biden?
That's a big question. I mean, I think Joe has evolved on a lot of issues. Everybody brings up his record, and there's a lot of problems there.
Yeah.
But I think he evolved during the Obama administration. You do remember that he's the one who prompted the president to come out for same-sex marriage.
Yeah, I don't quite buy that story. I mean,
we reported
yes
it on
and
Gay
no.
USA.
Yes and no. He got out ahead of him, and almost got punished by the administration for doing
my
it.
attitude on the whole thing about that's when I say we haven't endorsed a candidate, let it play out for a while.
You bet.
And we'll see who does well, and then we'll see, because we have to get rid of Trump.
All right, before we get to local politics, a couple of other heinous Trump administration acts. The Health and Human Services Department wants to stop collecting data on LGBTQ kids in foster care and parents, because then they might have to pay attention to them.
But a federal judge blocked the Trump Title X gag order that was aimed to destroy Planned Parenthood.
And ICE has finally released the trans woman Nicole Garcia Aguilar from Honduras, asylum-seeking refugee. She had been granted asylum and then held in prison for another 7 months by ICE.
Awful.
But is now finally
And
out.
at the United Nations, the U.S. joined the axis of evil with Russia and China in watering down a resolution combating the use of rape as a weapon of war. They stripped it of a formal mechanism to monitor and report atrocities, and Trump refuses to agree to any UN document that refers to sexual or reproductive health because he thinks it implies support for abortion, and they oppose the use of the word gender because they see that as an entryway for transgender rights.
He doesn't think anything. The focus on the family tells him what to do on these things.
I mean, this thing did pass with omissions that Trump sought, but the United Kingdom and France and Belgium vociferously objected to these omissions.
Yeah. Meanwhile, no matter what happens in the Supreme Court with those employment cases, Nancy Pelosi says the Equality Act will come to a floor vote in the House next month.
It better.
And that will be the end of it for the moment.
Well, you keep saying if it came to the floor of the Senate, it might pass, because there are a few Republicans who support it.
Technically possible. Certainly no Trump signature unless he thought that would get him reelected, and I suppose that's possible too.
Can we give them some good news from Florida?
Please.
Okay. Jane Castor, 59 years old, we have a picture of her, was elected the first, I believe, first out LGBTQ mayor well, certainly of Tampa, but of a major Florida city.
It's true.
She has a long history of leading the South in policies of inclusion. She won 73% of the vote. What's she been doing for the last 31 years? She's been a cop, including being the police chief down there from 2009 to 2015.
So this year alone, in recent elections, we've elected a lesbian mayor of Chicago, a lesbian mayor of Madison, Wisconsin. We have a lesbian mayor in Seattle, Washington, and we have a runoff for the post in Kansas City, Missouri that includes a lesbian as the chief frontrunner in the campaign.
It's not too late for a lesbian to run for president.
No, far from it. Or for one of the current female candidates to come out as a lesbian.
And locally, New York out City Council member Jimmy Van Bramer, who we know very well, is running for Queens Borough president in 2021.
In Kentucky, the Bowling Green City Commission, by a vote of 3-2, has rejected a non-discrimination law for housing and employment. They're going to make a second try at this on May 7th, but so far we're losers there. In Tennessee, Megan Fox, star actress, has been tweeting against the slate of hate, the bills anti-LGBTQ
Well,
bills
3 of those
proposed.
6 bills are advancing to the governor next week. One of them encourages school districts to adopt policies prohibiting trans students from using facilities aligned with their gender. And now another allows taxpayer-funded child welfare agencies to discriminate against LGBTQ people and minority faiths.
In Atlanta, Georgia, we have the first out black bisexual businessman, Antonio Brown, winning the runoff for city council. First black LGBTQ person on the city council.
Texas is also moving on
34 years old.
Texas is moving on a bunch of anti-LGBT bills, allowing licensed professionals, doctors, lawyers, and accountants to turn away business except in cases of severe injury or risk of death. And of course, a lot of tech companies and others are opposing this.
The story I hate the most this week at Coachella in California, former disgraced, corrupt Illinois Congressman Aaron Schock.
Second from left.
Known to be gay but not out, still very anti-gay in his voting record in the U.S. House of Representatives, hanging out with the gay crowd in Coachella, seen kissing men, and 2 guys who were with him have now apologized for hanging out with him, saying they didn't know his record and are now embarrassed to have been seen with him. I'm embarrassed to have done the story.
Will Rossi and Bob Massey. They were embarrassed.
Yeah, I am too. In South Carolina, the legislature refuses to pass a bill that allows religious discrimination. That's a good thing in South Carolina.
Dr. Richard Green has died. He was a pioneering psychiatrist in the normalization of LGBT people. He died in London, but he was Brooklyn born and did most of his work here. He worked with like John Money on sexuality back in the 60s. He testified in 1962 for a man being deported to Nicaragua for being gay. And he worked on transgender issues. He was founding editor of the Archives of Sexual Behavior in 71.
A real hero.
Challenged the illness model of homosexuality, and he asked if heterosexuality should be considered a mental disorder, given all the problems that they seem to have with it. This is back in 73, and he was just quite the pioneer.
Yeah, great guy. Now we have a string of stories from the Southeast.
Well, let me start with what I thought was a kind of a cute, positive one from Alabama. Carson Jones, he's the gay son of Doug Jones down there, the senator in Alabama. He wore a T-shirt in public there saying, "Some dudes marry other dudes, get over it." And he was a little nervous in Alabama, but he said 9 people stopped him in the Piggly Wiggly to say they loved that shirt's message. And he said he was feeling such support in a red state, and please don't write us off. Okay. then we go to some of the negative stories.
Well, in Huntsville, Alabama, at Huntsville High School, Nigel Shelby was bullied terribly. And was a very sweet guy who was beloved by his friends and family, 15 years old, and he ended up taking his own life. He was a suicide.
And the local sheriff there posted on social media calling the LGBT movement fake in light of this suicide, and asserted his right to be offended by gay people. Oh man, so he's been suspended. But we should point out that a group called the there's a drag brunch down there that raised money to pay for this kid's, Nigel's, funeral, and that there's a GLSEN chapter in Huntsville for teens who are seeking support.
And then in Mississippi, where in Mississippi is this? Trevor Gray.
Yes.
So he's described as a tremendously outgoing, friendly, social, straight guy.
Show a picture of him.
He goes to a bar. He goes and he's hanging out with the locals there who did not look so appealing. But one of the guys he's hanging out with says, everybody come back to my place. So he goes back to their place. He doesn't know these people. And guess what? They ended up calling him a faggot and beating him up.
Breaking his jaw.
Yes. He didn't want to go to the hospital. He's such a nice guy. He didn't want to go to the hospital.
They have been arrested.
Yeah, and so he was attacked for being perceived as gay.
Yes,
which is unfortunate.
Which is what happens when there's a lot of when you allow homophobia to run rampant.
Now, a couple of other stories of violence not in the Southeast. First of all, in Alaska at North Pole High School, a trans boy was using the boys' restroom. 7 boys got upset about this, and they went and invaded the girls' restroom and were, being very aggressive with the girls in there because they were mad that this trans boy came into their restroom. So one of the girls kicks one of the boys in the groin, knees him or something. She gets punished and suspended. There is an uproar over this. She's disciplined. They finally disciplined the boys. There was a whole community meeting about this, and basically they were at first supportive of the fact that these boys were so offended that a trans boy, was in their bathroom. Honest to God. And then worse, in New York, in the Bronx, Kawasaki Trawick, 32 years old, HIV positive, bisexual, had moved to the city to have a better life, had some mental illness, had periodic problems, and he was off his meds or something and was walking around with a knife in one hand and a stick in the other, and the cops were called by a neighbor, and they come and they try to tase him, and it doesn't take, and he's still walking around with the knife and the stick, and they shoot him dead.
In London, they throw a net over you when you're mentally ill and you're doing stuff like this. They don't shoot you dead. The net would neutralize them.
The net is really the answer.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
And this is supposed to be a liberal city. It isn't.
No, it isn't.
All right. A terrible study that shows that same-sex borrowers are 73% more likely to be denied mortgages despite being less risky, and when approved are hit with higher interest rates. This was in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences.
Good news, as far as I'm concerned. Judith Clark, out lesbian, in prison for decades for being the getaway driver in the Brinks robbery years ago, where a murder of 2 cops, I think.
Two cops or guards, yes, were
took
killed.
place during the robbery. She did not kill anyone. She did not plan any killings.
But she was part of it, and she was sentenced to basically life in prison. Governor Cuomo commuted her sentence last year so she could be eligible for parole. This is her second time up, and she was a model prisoner. And the thing is,
she totally changed her life philosophy. She worked with people with AIDS in the prison. She worked with training guide dogs. She did all sorts of magnificent things, which she will keep doing, and she's finally getting out.
We have to believe in rehabilitation, but I don't think we believe in rehabilitation for President Bolsonaro of Brazil.
No.
And there's going to be this Brazilian American event to honor him as the Brazilian of the Year, and Mike Pompeo as the American of the Year. And it was originally going to be at the American Museum of Natural History. They got so much crap from their employees that they had to cancel it, even though they weren't sponsoring it. So it moved to Cipriani Wall Street, and now it's going to be held at the Marriott Marquis on May 14th.
Because Cipriani rejected it too.
Yes, they did too. The
Marriott Marquis will take anyone, evidently.
It's going to be a tough one to get into. Tickets are $30,000. But we got to be at this protest, and this is right in the theater district. I mean, this guy, as you know from the show, is a monster.
He is a monster, and so people are paying $30,000 to suck up to him. Wow. All right, better news. In Madison, Wisconsin, Scott Anderson was reordained as the first official out gay Presbyterian minister.
Reordained?
Yes.
What does that mean?
Well, he'd been ordained and then he was forced out.
Oh, I see.
So now he is coming back in.
A priest forever.
Yeah, and he'd had to turn in his stole, and he got that back, and it was this whole thing. In Virginia, the appeals court has rejected a request for release of Chelsea Manning, who is in prison because she won't testify about Julian Assange again.
In June, there's going to be a special on HBO about Chelsea. XY Chelsea, I think it's called.
Okay.
Yeah.
It reminds me of the old Elizabeth Taylor, Susanna York movie, X, Y, and Z, which was a great lesbian movie.
Directed by Richard,
I don't know.
Forget it. I saw it.
X, Y, and Z.
When I was a
Talk
kid.
about a cheesy lesbian movie.
When I was a kid.
Wow.
When I was a kid.
A couple of education stories. In Hyattsville, Maryland, a middle school drama club's been practicing for 3 months, rehearsing to do the 25th annual Putnam County Spelling Bee. At the last minute, some parent complains that there are gay parents portrayed in the show, and they cancel it.
It was written by a homosexual, William Finn, our friend.
And then the school lies and says, well, it's because there's bad language in it. Well, you can remove bad language from these plays if you want to. Often. They went to the publishing company and said, oh, yeah, that would have been fine. So they're still up in arms. They may or may not do some production of it, but really it's about, and the kids are just furious. And they've been rehearsing for 3 months.
Kids, take it to a private venue and do the show. That's what happens
idea.
sometimes.
And in Hesperia, California, 4 years ago, teacher Julia Frost was helping the GSA students complain about discrimination by the administration, and she got fired for that, and she has now just won a $850,000 settlement.
Wow.
The ACLU of Southern California was representing her, and that's a good thing because they did a bad thing to her. And the International Gay Rodeo Association wants us to know that on May 6th in LA, they'll be donating most of their archives to the One National Gay and Lesbian Archives at USC. They're seeking more memorabilia. If you have memorabilia from the gay rodeos, they want it. And, they are presenting posthumously their Paladin Award to board member and enthusiast Patricia Nell Warren. Okay, international news.
The front runner. Well, let's see.
Ireland, I think, first.
Sure.
Lyra McKee. Lyra
Yes.
McKee, 29 years old, extremely popular and admired young lesbian journalist, and covering the latest outbreaks of violence and troubles in Northern Ireland.
Right.
In Londonderry, and she was at a clash and was shot dead. And the entire nation is in mourning over this.
It was like 2 teenage punks from the dissident
Well, they've been
IRA.
let go. They've been let go. So we're not sure that they did it. They arrested these guys, but then they were released.
I mean, I watched the film of the people popping out from behind buildings to shoot at the crowd almost. I mean, it wasn't, but she's the one who died.
They don't think she was targeted, but everybody is so in mourning, both sides, that they think this might allow for some advance in reconciliation there.
And you know, she grew up bullied by her peers
Yeah.
and by the church, and she confronted their homophobia. And she did a thing where she wrote a letter to her 14-year-old self that was made into a short film. And if you get our emails, I will send this to you, the link to this film, which was quite touching.
She did a TED Talk that I watched that was very charming and
She
moving.
spent 5 years investigating the only rape crisis center in Northern Ireland and the government efforts to eliminate it. So a journalist sometimes can really make things happen.
She was seen as someone who was extremely significant and up and coming and expected to have an enormously important career, and people are just devastated by her loss.
Right.
So we're very sorry to hear about that.
Well, Brunei was challenged by the European Parliament over their law to stone gay people to death, and they wrote back saying, it will safeguard the sanctity of the family lineage and marriage and our traditional values. And they called for tolerance and respect for them, for its sovereignty and values. Now,
We don't criminalize people, just observe behavior.
Now, they noted, if you're to be convicted of this, there have to be no less than 2 or 4 men, I don't know whether they say 2 or 4, of high moral standing and piety as witnesses.
Even numbers. Honest to God, people, what kind of a world do we live
Well,
in?
we got a better decision in Italy. The High Court there issued a pro-gay, pro-immigrant ruling about a guy from the Ivory Coast. And at first, the immigration agency said they don't have a law against homosexuality in the Ivory Coast. Go home. And he said, my father killed my boyfriend there. My family's going to kill me if I go back. And so the High Court said, you got to hear his case again.
In Turkey, the Regional Administrative Court lifted the emergency ban on LGBTI events, saying that they still must assure safety and security. They're still challenging a second ban, but this means that they may actually get away with a pride parade this year. We've shown you many pictures and video of the people running around Istanbul trying to get away from the cops in the middle of pride parades and fire hoses and everything else.
Canada has unveiled an equality coin to mark the 50th anniversary of the decriminalization of gay sex.
It's very controversial, isn't it?
It was Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre, who put through that bill in '69, but an LGBT historian, Tom Hooper, said it commemorates a myth because the only thing they decriminalized was sex between men 21 and over in a private setting. It didn't lead to, it wasn't total liberation.
In St. Petersburg, Russia, 11 LGBT activists were detained for doing a day of silence protest on the streets. They had tape over their mouths and they were just hauled off by the cops.
In Uganda, President Museveni blamed outsiders for trying to convince Ugandans to perform oral sex on one another, and he said the mouth is for eating, not for sex.
Is that a thing? You go to Uganda and
What about the
promote
mouth
oral
for talking or kissing or, come on.
In Taiwan, they are approaching the May 24th deadline, 2 years after the court decision that said they had to legalize same-sex marriage. They still haven't decided after referenda and other things what to do. But 157 couples have planned to marry on May 24th, but the government could still pass a kind of half measure, which would just take everything back to court for further adjudication.
So the Pope met a group of pilgrims who had gone across Europe and to meet with him. And at the end of it, one of them was a gay comedian from Britain named Stephen Amos, who told him that he was gay. And the Pope said, it doesn't matter who you are or how you live your life. You do not lose your dignity. And then he said, giving more importance to the adjective, I guess the word gay, rather than the noun, this
Gay.
is not good. There are people that prefer to select or discard people because of the adjective. These people don't have a human heart. This from the church that just, doesn't want to give children to gay people at adoption agencies and fires everybody.
And rejects gay ambassadors
Yes,
from France.
for God's
and,
sake,
please.
come on.
The Cayman Islands is continuing its fight over same-sex marriage, which a court legalized. Competing demos in the streets. 2,000 people rallied against same-sex marriage. And in Japan, they published the court decision that said if you want to change your gender, you must have surgery to remove your reproductive capacity. That is constitutional because it's too confusing not to. It would upset people.
It's a very conservative society.
Yeah, well, evidently trans people have no human rights in Japan.
But in AIDS news, they did have a lot of fun at the Broadway Kiers Easter bonnet competition. They raised a record $6.6 million. Hamilton alone, the show, raised $500,000, and Lin-Manuel Miranda accepted the award.
Do not fall for the Republicans' promises to cover pre-existing conditions, including HIV and their non-existent new health care plan. It would have no limits on prices. There could be lifetime limits that make you run out of coverage very fast. All of this is going to be much less than the Affordable Care Act gives anybody now.
Okay.
Entertainment news.
You want to listen to some reviews? It was a busy week on Broadway.
Well, first let me tell you that in San Francisco, Beach Blanket Babylon is going to close on New Year's Eve after 45 years. It's the one with the big hats and the great show. Queen Elizabeth attended this thing.
Oh, my goodness.
I went to it years ago. Song parodies about politics and celebrities. So get your tickets before New Year's Eve.
Next thing you know, they'll be banning the Mermaid Parade.
I hope not.
But
the Brighton Beach Pride Parade, Edition 3 for 2019, comes up May 19th in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn. It is a fantastic event because it is just people demonstrating in their community. It is a community event, and I highly recommend it. We'll tell you more as we get closer.
So almost every play I saw this week was about death or hell, and mostly funny. Beetlejuice seems to have a built-in audience who love the Tim Burton film. It's a musical version starring Alex Brightman there, who is very, very funny as the sort of, the one of the dead guys. But it's a very confusing trip through the land of the living in the netherworld.
Hated the movie.
Burn This. This is by the late out gay playwright Lanford Wilson from 1987 about a dancer, Kerry Russell, mourning one of her two gay roommates as she's pursued by a rich suitor, David Furr, and her late friend's brother, Adam Driver, who is sort of the star of the show. A very funny tour de force performance, but the play, I would say, is very dated. And it doesn't really reach the emotional impact that it wants to. It's kind of like good sitcom writing, which isn't bad.
Yeah.
Gary, a sequel to Titus Andronicus by Taylor Mack. Now,
Titus Andronicus was by Shakespeare.
Oh, really?
Yes.
There's Nathan Lane in the midst of all these dead bodies. It's after Titus Andronicus, where everybody dies and gets baked into pies. Well, Julie White opens this show, and when she comes out behind the curtain, I couldn't stop laughing. But she disappears very quickly, and most of it is a back and forth between Lane and Christine Nielsen as maids who are cleaning up this mess, and then it's every puerile joke. It means to be about the destruction of our society and how far we've fallen. But I got pretty bored after a while with the level of screaming at each other about this the whole time.
Sounds pretty one note.
I think if I were used drugs, I might have enjoyed it more.
Okay.
I loved Hadestown in London, and now all the principal players are back here in New York, where it started at the New York Theater Workshop, where it really shines at the Walter Kerr Theater. That's Andre DeShields there. Put him up again. He opens the show. He plays Hermes. He narrates you through the show. And it's about Orpheus and Eurydice, Reeve Carney, and
well, we love Andre, and he's been here.
And he's terrific.
And we loved his King Lear.
And Patrick Page plays Hades, and he's got that wonderful bass baritone. And it's a tragedy, and it's tragic. And we sort of know what's going to happen after they go to hell and try to come back, but this woman in the front row was not prepared for this. She burst first she gasped when the truth of the show came out, and she could not stop crying, so Andre handed her some tissues from the stage, and the whole audience was aware of it. It's a wonderful show.
He broke the fourth wall.
Hadestown. Well, he's talking to us the whole time anyway.
I caught up with the Lehman trilogy, which you saw in London, and it is a magnificent theatrical show. It was playing at the Park Avenue Armory. It's ended now. It's going back to London and
in the West
opening
End.
again. Yeah, but I thought it was a little empty in its content.
3 actors playing all the roles of 150 years of the Lehman
family.
Firm, anyway, yeah.
I thought they were pretty light on the Lehmans. You know, the rapid accumulation of wealth with no comment struck me as a bit much.
You are right about that. It was still, to me, a great theatrical experience, especially for the first 2 acts.
It is, no question. And I sat through the whole thing for 3 hours and 20 minutes.
If you can go to London and see it, I recommend it.
Okay. Advocate, cover story Tyler Blackburn. Formerly of Pretty Little Liars and Roswell, New Mexico, where he plays a gay amputee vet, out as bisexual on the cover of The Advocate.
Our friend Michael Musto is going to be doing a gay version of the Hollywood Squares, Times Squares it's called, April 26th and every other Friday to June 21st. The guest stars include Everett Quinton, Flotilla DeBarge. It's at the Laurie Beekman Theater at 407 West 40 Beechman, sorry. 407 West 42nd Street. Go to spincyclenyc.com. I'll put that in our email.
Great cover story in the new issue of Them.us about Janelle Monáe. This is Condé Nast's gay publication, and she's wonderful. Janelle Monáe is just fantastic.
More than just a great singer. I mean, she's a,
Yeah, oh no, and a great pansexual or queer, she calls herself queer, role model. Remember Motherstruck, the play with Stacey Ann Chin, directed by Cynthia Nixon? Well, it's now in movie form and playing at the Tribeca Film Festival on Tuesday, April 30th. At 9:45 at the Battery Park Cinema.
We saw it on stage, and you may have seen the boys in the band on stage. A remake of the movie is with the original cast is in the works with Jim Parsons and Matt Bomer and Andrew Reynolds and Zachary Quinto and everybody. Robin DeJesus. Ryan Murphy, who produced the Broadway show, is bringing it to Netflix. I thought the 1968 movie kind of captured that.
I saw The Road Company in 1968 or 9.
Even if it was made by Billy Friedkin.
Speaking of Ryan Murphy, Pose comes back for its second season June 9th, and it's going to move up to the 80s and 90s and do Act Up, and Patti LuPone's going to be a regular character, so watch out for that. And To Wong Foo is being reissued on Blu-ray with extra material, and we'll see whether it holds up in 2019.
Well, somebody mentioned about Lanford Wilson's play. It was 1987, and somebody died, but it wasn't of AIDS, and they never even mentioned AIDS, and they had all these gay characters.
To be continued next week.
Yes, thanks for being with us. We'll see you.
See you then.
And try not to worry about the Supreme Court too much until it happens.
Bye.